A little while ago we looked at some of my worst Conan Exiles builds. You guys wanted more in various forms, so today we're looking back at this monstrosity to answer one simple question. Why is it so bad? So the build we're looking at today is the Island Home build guide from 5 years ago now, and this build was not my best work, I must admit. However, it's far from the easiest design to go through, and I think there's a few core and fundamental mistakes that made this build not so great that might make for a good learning experience for people that want to avoid mistakes like this in the future. So I built this base really far up in the cliffs on the northeast side of the map in the water. This is a really good building spot, but it comes with a caveat that you have to be at least a semi-decent builder to make it work. There's just far too many opportunities to create something that either overshadows the build, as you're about to see, or just doesn't really suit the vibe you're going for. For this build, there are definitely some problems, and the first problem is really here. Now, it doesn't look too bad from right now, but this is a really convoluted pathway that runs all the way up the cliff, and honestly, really serves to undermine the actual build itself. Furthermore, there are much better ways to do a walkway than I've done here. Now, I will admit, walkways are not easy, but having just subsequent elevator after elevator, sure, it might be one of the faster ways to get up the cliff, but it's certainly not the most aesthetically pleasing. Furthermore, I also think it really robs the player of the sense of journey as you go up the build. A good walkway kind of gives you the opportunity to look back and see how far you've gone. This walkway is very enclosed, it's very dense, and you don't really feel you've travelled all that far until you get to the top, which I think is a problem. Overall, this walkway pathway up to the build is not good, for many different reasons, the core one being that it undermines the build itself, but that also lends into a core issue with the build, is that it's just too small. As you can see here, the design is okay, it's a pretty standard design. I think I've built this design probably hundreds of times now, and there's nothing wrong with it. It's a very right angle turn design that it's common in almost anything, but the problem with this design is that at its core it's very small build focused. It's good for small builds. Now, this is a small build, but the problem is it looks really lost in the location it is. Was this just built on the ground in the Highlands? It'd still not be great, but you wouldn't really question it too much. But because I've chosen to build it where I have, the design for the location is quite inappropriate, and again just makes it feel really lost atop this cliff. Furthermore, we do have some issues with internal layout. It's already not a huge build to be working with, but what's actually on the inside causes some problems. As you can see, this is very densely packed, it's very tight, and I think if you were to actually create this build for yourself, you'd probably run out of room quite quickly. Definitely feels quite, claustrophobic, and I don't think that's a good thing. Here again you get a better shot of the walkway, and I think it really does sell how the walkway is this grand affair. Even though it does have its own issues, it's a very big part of the build that then leads up to essentially a small house. That isn't really the best, to be honest. It really undermines the build and just doesn't balance everything well. The interior again is quite cramped, and then the actual design of the build is not great, but also the choice of materials is perhaps not the best. Frontier can work in this area, but just purely Frontier alongside those horrid Frontier roofs is not the vibe, really. So it's clear this build is not working, but why is it not working? Firstly, the walkway is undermining the build and doesn't really serve a good purpose aesthetically as a walkway. It's more functional as opposed to aesthetic. The second reason is the size of the home itself. This is a pretty small house. It wouldn't look out of place on the ground somewhere, but because it's so high up in such a prestigious position, it feels very small and very lost and a bit inappropriate for where it is. The third issue is the interior layout. There are frankly too many ways to go all at once. There are doors everywhere, there's double sets of stairs, and this build is just too small to accommodate that. Lastly, the material choice is not great. Frontier can work here, but again, you need something to spice it up, and definitely get rid of those Frontier roofs. So we're actually in game now, and I have rebuilt the house portion of this build, not the walkway because the walkway is a problem. So, you can kind of see it has issues. The house is too small, too plain, and really doesn't actually utilise the cliff itself. I think if you're building somewhere like this, somewhere that is prime real estate for a build, you should utilise the area you have, and this doesn't utilise it at all, really. When you really pull back and come down to the shore, you can see that the build could be doing a lot more, and it's just kind of there. I think it looks larger than it is on the ground, mostly because you have all these support foundations. That doesn't really work all that well, to be honest, and I think you could do a lot better. If we chop off the roof here, you can see the top floor isn't really that great, to be honest. These double doorways here, it's something I used to do a lot back a good few years ago. It creates a lot of problems because I've explained this a few times. It's a difficult concept to communicate, but we'll try. So you already have doubles coming up here, which then creates a flow line all the way up here. However, you really kind of pigeonhole yourself by having two doors because you have a flow line here and a flow line here, and thus that's really the only space for anything other than clean traversal to a doorway, which really limits how you can move around. I'm going to turn that rain off. Furthermore, if we actually remove the first floor, you can see the same issue here on the ground. You have these double stairways here, which again really hamper your ability to move throughout the build. It basically leaves you with a 3x3 of livable space, which is not enough and definitely not what you'd expect for a build on top of a cliff like this. You then have a double balcony at the back, which no. Just no. And the balcony at the front is alright, I suppose. But overall, this is a build that looks like it belongs elsewhere. This is like a small solo base. This is not what you'd expect on top of a cliff, and again, it really doesn't utilise the cliff whatsoever. That really shouldn't happen. You should utilise your surroundings to the maximum. And given that there are only a few spaces like this in-game, this is really a disservice. So, knowing what the issues are, how do we fix it? The first thing to do probably would be to just tear it down and start again. Really, the big MO of this build should be to use the cliff. Now, you don't have to use all of it, you don't have to build all the way down here and all the way up there, because you are going to end up with something gargantuan, and at some point, if you build too much, it won't even really look like it's on a cliff, so you want to find a nice balance. However, I think sort of this one here should be at least the baseline of the build as to where it should sit. I think it should sort of almost claw onto the cliff, if that makes sense. The second thing we want to do is we want to change the material palette. Frontier does work here, but just Frontier is a bit dismal. I think instead we can weave in some Numidian, we can work around some different material shapes and sets, and we can come up with something quite nice that contrasts the environment while still feeling like it fits. Obviously, by tearing everything down, we're going to rebuild the interior. The interior is dreadful. It's not good. It creates a lot of problems, and that's not what you want from a good interior. You want it to be as smooth and as easy as possible. And lastly, we want to find a good solution for the walkway. The previous walkway was not good. It was just far too big for what the build was. That would work if the build was gargantuan, I suppose, but even then it feels a bit clumsy to just have walkway, elevator. So we're going to try and work out a nicer, more natural way. Maybe wrapping around the cliff would be very nice, but walkways around cliffs are difficult. So, with all that said, I'm going to rebuild it, and let's see how it comes out. Now this is much better. Obviously the first and biggest issue with the last one was the walkway. The walkway just made the build look almost stupid in a way, so we've just done a very simple wraparound walkway suspended by pillars. It's nothing too fancy, but what it is it suits the environment. It wraps around the cliff really nicely. It doesn't look too out of place, it looks a bit rickety perhaps, but given that it's exposed to the elements, probably it should look like that. It wraps around very nicely, it's very low key, and it leads eventually up to just a fairly simple side entrance. The walkway doesn't need to be anything extreme, it doesn't need to be anything grand, but what it does need to do is it needs to fit the environment. The last one was almost forceful in the way that it just asserted itself and just said, this is the walkway. Sometimes that works, but I don't really think it was taking advantage of the setting of this build. This one works a lot better. Because we've kept the walkway so simple as well, it doesn't undermine the build at all. In fact, it almost makes it seem a little bigger, because you've got this walkway which is fairly long and fairly large, but it looks small compared to the rest of the build. The second thing you will of course notice is the material palette as well. We've gone for Arena, Numidian, and Frontier, with a little bit of Aesir up there. It's a pretty simple colour and material palette, but I think it works really well. It suits this environment, but also doesn't all blend into one big blob, which was kind of the problem with the last one. Now of course you'll also notice that the actual size of the build itself is much larger. Generally speaking, I kind of prefer smaller builds across the board, but sometimes you do need to go large, and this is one of the cases. I think back then I probably thought it'd look a bit stupid to overhang the cliff with the build itself, and it can do if you do it wrong. However, as you can see, I've kind of tapered everything in, brought everything down to a solid foundation, and then added in the overhangs, so it all looks a little bit more natural. You've got sections like this where I want to say the build almost claws into the cliff, which is the design I was going for, and then you've got segments like this where it's clearly intended to be a core shape here that is then extended out from, which gives the build a bit more of a logical branch out of where it is. You've got a few different roof designs going on, nothing really that fancy if we're being honest, but it breaks things up and keeps things looking nice. And then of course you've got a little tower at the back. I'm a sucker for a good tower in a larger build, and I think this really helps to bring the height level of the build up at the apex right at the rear, and overall provides a nice balance. I think without that, it might look a little strange, but with it, I think it grounds it nicely. Now of course the last problem was the interior. The flow of the last build was not good. This one should be much better. So the intended path through the build is you come in through the entranceway, and this can be a sort of atrium, cloakroom, whatever you want. Dump chest room is probably what I'd use it for, because I'm terrible at chest organising. And then you come through into this staircase section. You can of course fit things in here as well, which leads us up into the main building itself. So you've got a fair amount more room here than you had before, with this side passage here. Kitchen, storage room, workshop, whatever you like. You've got a side room here, space under the stairs, and it's all quite spacious. Because the stairs are only here, it just makes life so much easier. Now if you didn't want anything on the stairs, you can push them a little bit back further, but because there's no double staircase like there was in the last one, you've got all this space to play with. If we go upstairs, it's split into two, so you've got the tower section here, we'll return to this in a moment, and then you've got the upstairs here. Now, realistically, would I have liked this slightly larger? Maybe, but you have more usable space here than you had in the last one because you don't have the double staircase, and the double staircase takes up a lot of room. So you've got a very nice sort of right angle turn over there, space for your bed or whatever you like there, nice little section to look down on the stairs, and then of course you have the tower. The tower is really simple. It doesn't necessarily serve a function. It can do, of course, you can put other things in this if you like, but I think we've built in such a unique location, it's criminal not to have at least somewhere where you can stand and take it all in, and you can look out over the curse wall as well, which I definitely didn't die to accidentally while building this. And overall, I think the tower is a great aesthetic choice. You can of course make it more practical with workstations, separate floors and such, but aesthetically I think it adds a lot to both the interior and the exterior of the design. So it's evident the previous design of this build from 5 years ago had problems, but what problems did it have? I didn't build for the environment, I undermined the core build with oversized exterior designs, namely that walkway. I did not keep a clear path of traversal through my build. The build itself was, frankly, just too small for the setting, and though my choice of Frontier was kind of environment appropriate, there was just too much of it. It was just a big blob. This design instead has clear, defined shapes and structures and is much better for it. I think one of the key takeaways for almost any builder from this should be building with the environment. Now, this is a really difficult topic, to be honest. It's not the easiest thing to teach, it's not the easiest thing to learn. And with some builds, like this cliff build, you are stepping it up to a different degree than you would be just somewhere in the desert. This is a build that really requires you to have quite good knowledge of how to build with the environment, but also how to incorporate it into the build. If you're building somewhere as unique as here, you don't want to cloak it all in brick and wood. Build it with the environment in mind, keep the environment present, and not overshadow either aspect. Obviously, that's much easier said than done, and sometimes there are times when you will want to create something that forces itself upon the environment. This wasn't one of those cases, and now that we've actually treated the cliff properly as we should have in the first place, the build is far, far better. Anyway, that's going to wrap us up for today. I hope you've all enjoyed. There was quite a few requests on my previous video reacting to my worst builds to kind of explain why some of these builds were so bad. And to be fair, in the last build, yeah, we just laughed at them because they were bad. However, in this one, I wanted to give you some actual advice, some actual tips that you can use to avoid creating the same stuff I did. Anyway, that will wrap us up for today. Thank you for watching. If you have enjoyed this video, do leave a like and let me know in the comments below. I know a lot of people also wanted some dedicated rebuild videos of some of the builds that I showcased in my worst builds video. I didn't expect so many people to want to see that, but people wanted it, a lot more people than I expected, so we will be doing that at some point soon. Thank you for watching, and a massive thanks to our wonderful esteemed coffee cultists for continuing to support the channel over on Patreon. Do check out the Patreon link in the description. There's early access to videos, wallpapers, blueprints, and more. $10 patrons and above get early access to every single video, sometimes weeks or months in advance. So if you enjoy my content and do want to help support the channel directly, please do check us out. Again, thank you for watching, take care, and I'll see you soon.